Okay, so if it's all right with you, this was my plan. I thought I would start by telling you and anyone who might be listening why I wanted to talk to you, and then if you could say why you are talking to me as well.
Okay.
So I've started this channel. I started 3 years ago, and then I made one episode, and that's as far as I went, and I lost the nerve. Um, and I still barely have the nerve because I don't know if
I
I
saw
want to.
some of that episode. That was intriguing. So,
Okay, well, there's going to be a much more extensive follow-up, hopefully within a month, maybe in a couple weeks. But okay, so did you see my most recent intro as well?
yes.
Okay, so I should maybe go over it because people watching this won't necessarily have seen it. So anyways, my idea was to have a channel where I improve me, basically. And I've seen lots of channels where people are telling everyone what they should think and do. And this is supposed to be the opposite in some ways. And my idea is that I want to be pretty direct and open and expressive, but I try to cultivate the right state of mind going in so that I'm doing it for good, so to speak. But I'm hoping within those that if I do it right, I can keep it personal and humble, so I can say whatever I want, essentially, without being too irritating to anyone. And at the same time, it'll be useful information. And I'm picking people who I think will help me and hopefully other people. So as far as why I'm talking to you, I noticed some years ago that when I encountered, whether it was actual people I encountered who, in my case, it's always been Christian. So if I say religious or religion, I'm talking about Christians, and we could discuss which particular denominations, but I'm not really making a distinction. My impression, and this is all my impression, it could be all wrong, was that the sort of view they had, the way they saw things, did not appeal to me. It seemed like it did not suit my kind of personality. I said this in my email too, but it didn't seem to emphasize exploration and changing yourself. It was, as if get these answers, get these rules, and then live this boring conventional life. And then maybe you'll go to a boring conventional afterlife. Like that was my impression. And so it wasn't very appealing. And I realized that if I was either watching some debate or involved in some debate, which is a big mistake, arguing for you could say an agnostic or atheist perspective at the time, but more likely I was just saying, well, that argument seems dumb and that argument seems dumb. There was nothing positive happening. That argument wasn't really honest because it seemed to be based on the assumption that we actually came to our positions through logic and arguments. And of course, I don't know anyone who did. You grow into it, you encounter things that seem to fit with you, and it's, in a way, I think you can believe anything you want, but I don't mean that in a trivial way. I mean that anything you can, if you want to, you can rejig anything to make sense. The question is, what makes sense to you? What sort of character do you have? And that's, I think, the right way. That's the human way things work. So with all that in mind, I thought, here's someone who could perhaps give me some religious nuggets or a different perspective that would not fit that dull, claustrophobic, dead sort of mold that I'd had of religion, and instead something that would be more alive and interesting. And even if I can just have something to chew on, I think it'll be interesting. And I'm hoping that people who watch this might be attracted to it as I would have been. And so they could have go through the same process that I go through as I talk to you. So that's why I'm here. And that's why I contacted you.
That's a good reason. I like it.
Okay.
I try to say yes as much as I can without I try to say yes as much as I can without sort of, while being faithful to the in real life partners that I have all over my life, my family, my church, the people that are in, 24/7 in real life space with me. So because my YouTube channel grew to a size, which isn't a huge size, but it grew big enough. And I guess I'm doing it in a certain way. When I started putting randos conversations on YouTube, realizing that, more people are interested in talking to me than I have time for, which is an enormous blessing, but is also a burden. And so I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to manage that, how to prioritize. And that's probably tougher than I would have thought 4 years ago, but here it is. So I like your introduction. And it prompts a lot of thoughts on my part, because I mean, the boring aspect, I've been quite persuaded that it's a realistic theory that the bicameral mind that we have, this brain that we have, on one hand looks for unknown territory and the other tries to map it. And so I'm not surprised that religion, when people find something that they get excited about, they like to share it. That's a key aspect of human nature that makes us really powerful as a species on this planet, because we both have a hunger for new information, for unmapped territory. And when we map an unmapped territory, we have a natural desire to share that mapping.
Right.
And so in real life face-to-face community, let's say a Dunbar number of a community of less than 200 people that you would expect to actually know if we didn't have all of this, printing press and electronic media, those things would likely work fairly well. As we scale up via printing press, media, we sort of jiggle with these numbers. The religious aspect, I think that's a word to pay a little attention to, because that word only started being used as it is now in some ways it's a fairly recent development, and it has a lot to do with a lot of other deeper assumptions and presuppositions in our culture. So I would imagine what you were probably reacting to is a further development also, especially within Christian communities and but especially Christian communities in North America, where Christians began in their mission to spread their faith, began to use commercial practices to promote their ideas. So the Jehovah's Witnesses basically took the door-to-door sales strategy, and especially Christians that are really excited about proselytizing really like using those tools and tricks to try to promote their message. And there's a deeply consumerist layer going on, but in many cases, you can't really sell Jesus like you can sell an iPhone, because even if they called the iPhone the Jesus phone, at least they did about 10 years ago.
Did they? I missed that.
Yeah, that was a fairly early. This is the Jesus phone because it does everything. But it's sort of a category confusion, because how one's religious belief is integrated in a life has to be very different from a consumer product. And the consumerization of Christianity is, because someone might come up to you and say, well, once you believe in Jesus, or once you love Jesus, or once you go to church, then our consumer instincts that have been carefully cultivated by this culture sort of trip us into, well, then all of my problems will be solved. And well, anybody who goes to a church should know that that's not the truth, because 100% of people who go to church have problems. So if they're selling Jesus in that way, it's kind of dumb, because pretty quickly they're going to realize, oh, Jesus didn't fix my hernia or my hemorrhoids or my boring marriage or my stupid job, and my kids don't necessarily love me better. Now, maybe there've been some incremental improvements because of a bunch of things that path has begun to develop in them, but it's not like Jesus is not preparation H. It just doesn't work that way. He's not an ointment you put on people to resolve their butt hurt. So yeah, I totally understand why you have that impression of Christians watching a lot of the consumerist promotional noises that Christians make.
Well, and two, if either having been occasionally involved in a argument, discussion, debate about religion, like a more personal one, or having listened to on the radio or something, some debate, it's a debate, and it doesn't go well, and it's not convincing. And fundamentally, I think the thing is that this goes along with my idea that you believe what you want to, not in the sense that people will believe any old thing, but it has to make sense to them in an emotional way. Is that so? Argument just doesn't do it. It can in certain cases, I guess, but I just don't think generally it does. And I'm kind of worried about anyone who was entirely convinced by arguments one way or the other, for or against religion. And then two, I mean, and to be clear, I'm coming at this with the assumption that there is more. So there's the assumption. I'm not searching. It's not that I want to join a church necessarily, but I'm just seeing what's there. And I thought that this would be an interesting way to approach a conversation, because it's not what I've seen before. If I could just take a few minutes just to reel off some other points, just to give you a better sense of where I'm coming from. Would that be all right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Right. Okay. So here's a good example. On YouTube, I saw this near-death experience being relayed. So this guy was making a speech about it. And now there are different ways you could interpret this. I'm going to say how I interpreted it and how I remembered it. What I remember was that part of the climax was that he got a glimpse of heaven, or what he or we were supposed to think was heaven. And that it was this, he described it as a perfect lawn with no dandelions in it. Now, I grew up in the country and I like dandelions. And so now here's something you could say. I may have recalled incorrectly. Maybe he said it was as if it was that, or who knows? Maybe that was just his experience, and because that was what suited him. Who knows? I'm not going to. It's not like that. That's not an argument one way or the other. But the point is that he is consistent with this impression I have of a sort of closed-minded, overly human-centered, ethnocentric, self-centered, urban. Bleh. And if that is correct, nothing makes any sense to me, more or less. Basically, my feeling is, arrogant or otherwise, that can't be right. Now, I'm not saying that that's an argument against his experience, because I don't know what to make of that. But the point is, that's an example of something where I don't even have to get into any history or any other theological arguments. That immediately, discredits itself, basically, to me, as that view. And I get that feeling too, that I constantly like to change how I see things. That's a big deal for me as a source of enjoyment and satisfaction, is finding new ways to look at things. Not to say that I'm particularly good at trying out other people's perspectives, but just that when I find something that fits, it's fun to see something a new way. You can just sit in a chair and then suddenly see things different. Science can do that. Philosophy can do that. And yet, again, sort of the mainstream or religion as I would encounter it seems to be almost at odds with science and philosophy, which is bizarre. It should be science and philosophy, I think, right? Like it's all the same stew.
Well, it's funny, because let's imagine that the person who had the near-death experience is a lawn maintenance guy who works on a golf course, and what he's always trying to do is eradicate dandelions. It would make perfect sense that his vision of heaven is a lawn without dandelions.
But now
in other words,
now he's got nothing to do. Yeah.
Well, okay, but now, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, we have a problem of perspective. Modernity, I go into this in a lot of my videos. Modernity assumes we can see an objective world, a view from nowhere.
Which is wrong.
What's that?
Which is wrong.
Right, because how can you? Because you are seeing something, and so you're seeing from somewhere. And so the thing that you're seeing will always have a piece of you, because you are seeing through you. Right. And all of those filters, in fact, come into play. So if you look at, I mean, part of the difficulty that you have is how much of the church can you look at? Have you, for example, ever pondered why Newton wrote the theology he did? Have we pondered why science used to be called something like natural theology, and that this, in fact, was sort of the breakout of science in the Christian world, and why it was in the Christian world that science and technology took the shape it did? I'm not going to in any way fight you on the fact that way too many churches are religious programmatic induction centers. That is in some ways what churches have decided they should be, at least in terms of how they face the world. And probably, unless you're actually involved in a church, most of the churches that will come into your consciousness will look like that, because those are the only churches you're going to see. I remember a number of years ago, I bought a blue Subaru, and I was driving around in that blue Subaru, just having this, I had no idea how many Subarus there were out in the world and how many of them are blue. Now, between the time that I bought before and after the time I bought that Subaru, I don't think the number of Subarus jumped within 2 days in terms of the streets that I'm in. Why suddenly am I seeing blue Subarus everywhere? Well, it's because I just bought one, and that's in my consciousness. And so the filters are selecting Subarus. Oh, they've got a Subaru, and they've got a Subaru, and they've got a Subaru. So now I'm doing the same thing with Mazdas, because I just bought a Mazda. So I think it's helpful, and part of, people will often say to me when my channel, I'm so surprised that a pastor would talk about the kinds of things you talk about. And I say to them, I'm not surprised at all, because I know many, many pastors who love to have these conversations. They just can't find any conversation partners, partly because nobody expects them to want to talk about any of these things, partly because, I don't know, look at what a pastor is on TV. If those are the only pastors you see, they're these really weird, parsimonious, creatures that are completely out of touch with the world. And every pastor I know gets way too big a slice of the real world sitting across from them in their office most weeks than they would care to see, because that's the way the real world is. And people come to pastors when they have a problem, and usually they come to pastors with problems that are in one way or another unsolvable. So that's sort of what it's like from this end looking out. And so what have sort of happened in my YouTube channel is that, to one degree or another, I think I was able to open that up a bit to people and say, I understand why our side looks like it does to you. Maybe we can lower those barriers and have an honest conversation, because to me, that's far more interesting than have someone come around and just sort of project what they imagine a pastor should be on me.
I do wonder, there's a tricky problem, I think, too, with religion. Okay, so I understand if there's perhaps problems with making a distinction between religion and other things like philosophy. Arguably, if you're religious, religion is everything. And I've lost track of what my point is. But I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that most people want to think intensely about what's real and what's most important and philosophy and what they believe and what they should believe. They might dabble in that, but I don't know how many people are continuously interested in it.
Right.
So I do wonder,
small amount.
So as a pastor with any size, but let's say it's a fairly small congregation, there just isn't going to be that much of a market for it. Like, I think most people just want to get on with living. Now, I'm not sure what role religion would play for them, but there's this problem of it having to be, you have to be able to present it to people at different levels, I would think, to match their level of interest and abilities to think about different things. And not everyone's going to want to or be able to think about everything to the same degree. So I don't know how you deal with that. And maybe it does mean that you speak to the lowest common denominator. Or, well, what do you do?
Sort of, you speak to the personal. because you're exactly right. Philosophy is fairly theoretical. It's a theoretical abstraction and a certain mode of thinking that a fairly small percentage of the population enjoys engaging in. And one of the things that you learn very quickly as a pastor is the thing that almost everyone is interested in is themselves, because that is the little center of their world. And out from themselves is what they're interested in, which is usually some pretty reliable things. They're interested in, their comforts, their anxieties, their preservations. And if you look at, now, religion is the cheapest and easiest con in the world. It really is. And I watch plenty of people working the religious con in Christian and non-Christian, with Christian and non-Christian tools all over the place. Because not only is it the case that we are all deeply interested in ourselves, it is also the case that we quite naturally relate to our environment relationally. People name their cars and talk to them.
Right.
People name their dogs and cats and talk to them. Now, they will swear to you that their dog and cat understands. A scientist will look at that and say, no, you very much do have a personal relationship with your pet. But when you're talking to your dog and your dog looks up at you and you think, oh, your dog feels guilty for peeing on the rug, that's probably not guilt that your dog is feeling, because your dog is working its relational tools towards you. And it just so happens that human beings and dogs match fairly closely. And so we've had a very long relationship with each other. Cats, not so much. The vast majority of animals, not at all. Even just the number of animals that can be domesticated is really quite small compared to the number of species on the planet. So, but this is what we do. This is how we live. And religion fundamentally works off those things, because, so I was just in the video that I presented today, a part of that video, I dealt with Michael Shermer and Jordan Peterson, and Michael Shermer lays out for Jordan Peterson the pretty standard modernist atheist skeptical treatment of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the reason Jordan Peterson always gives the kinds of answers he does to those questions, which for the most part simply confuse people, is because Jordan Peterson understands something about people, which is that I am talking to a picture on the screen upon which I am madly projecting all of this unconsciously, all kinds of things about you that I don't know, but have sort of been built up in me over 30 years of pastoral conversations and 50 some years of human conversations. And so I'm making huge guesses about who you are based on a list of things that we wouldn't have time to actually go into and list. But that's happening between us all the time right away. And so what is of really less concern for you is if, you were in the first century and could sort of poke at Jesus' resurrected flesh, the story is far more operative in the life of you. And that story is connected to a small number of people that you actually have real life interactions with that creates a plausibility structure. Now, again, all of that is philosophical and theoretical and psychological, but we all sort of manage that unconsciously, unthinkingly, completely naturally when we have a first impression of someone and say, oh, I like that person, or I don't like that person. Happens all the time. Go ahead and look at the research of how many people saw a future husband and wife, saw them for the first time and said, I like that person. I might marry that person. It happens all the time. Why? Because there's way more going on with us than this little conscious self in front has any idea of. And so as a pastor, if you actually want to help people, and by helping people, it's usually very it's very common. They're anxious, they're scared, they're excited, they're hopeful, they want, they don't want. I mean, these are sort of the basics. And the fact that these very quickly get connected up with all sorts of stories that may be with God or the government or the doctor or a lover or a child. That's what we swim in. And pastors actually, whether they're conscious of the psychology or not, pastors actually swim in those waters to sort of try to help people manage their story verse and live in it well.
I'm half understanding what you're saying. I'm not quite clear on how it relates to the general topic.
Why do I want to talk to you? Number one, you're enlarging my story verse because I'm still doing massive projection on you because I don't know you very well, but you're adding to the data. Number two, a part of me, just like I said earlier, thinks I found some things that are really helpful in life. And because I'm a human being, I'd like to share them with you. And I'd like you to celebrate them with me. That's a deep need that I have. Now, there's a tiny little group of people that have been basically participating in a conversation that in some ways, in terms of science, is only about 100 years old, but in terms of humanity, goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Jesus and Moses and the Hebrew prophets, that we've been working on these questions because life in this world is hard and there's a lot of pain, and we don't like pain, and we do like hope, and we want better rather than worse, but we try to get something better, and often we find it's making it worse. That's the level that pastoring and conversations really play on, but it connects up to a huge world. And when I listen to you talk, you say, I'm kind of bored with all these little pat answers because, if I found a better thing, I'd probably be using it already, and then I would go on to the next better thing. That's what it means to be human in a lot of ways. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Somewhat, yes.
I'll keep asking questions. I'll try and give shorter answers.
That's all right, because one of my concerns is that I will talk more than 50% of the time, in general. And that's sort of my general rule is for podcasting, don't talk more than 50% of the time, given that there's someone else hypothetically taking part. So you're making that easier. I thought I'd bring up C.S. Lewis because it's relevant and because I thought you'd get a kick out of it. So I don't remember the book that this was in. There was a chapter, I think it was called A Chapter Strictly Not Necessary, or Not Strictly Necessary, where he was, if I remember the title correctly, he was addressing a concern that he thought he would have had, which was that the idea of God making everything, the world, the universe, everything is made in some sense, and that then it's not perhaps the most real thing, which maybe is part of an afterlife. I don't remember if he was saying this or if I'm just adding it. Could mean to some people that it makes this world seem artificial. It makes nature seem artificial. And I would add, I have had this impression sometimes with the language that's used. It's like it's a zoo or a park. That's the role of nature. And even if it's presented in heaven, it's like an idyllic zoo. All the animals get together. Again, there's this feeling of, whereas what appeals to me is, and then he didn't really solve the problem for me, but he said something interesting, which was that really God is the wildest creature of all. I think that's pretty much a quote, but I read this years ago. And that was kind of where I left it. So I didn't actually know how God was the wildest creature of all, but it was an interesting idea. So there's a hint of a different way of thinking of things. And to give you a little bit more information about me, which I actually meant to do at the beginning, I've grown up basically in the country and outside a lot. And I was homeschooled as well, so I'm sort of out of the mainstream. And so nature is a big deal, I think. And so that is something that, when someone's talking about getting rid of the dandelions in heaven, so to speak, that kind of thing really seems weird, because to me, part of when I'm thinking of something that feels like it's profound and can change me. I think of, wild natural situations in part. And there's this feeling I've had, I try to explain it. If I'm in the forest on my own, there's a sense of a watching silence that I try to describe by saying a benevolent indifference. This is the wild part of nature. It's benevolent because it's made me in a sense, and here I am, and it's letting me do whatever I want. But it's indifferent. I could, get my foot stuck in a hole and twist my ankle and die. I could do whatever. But there's this feeling of that it's watching, and somehow it's good, but at the same time it's wild and indifferent. And I'm not giving that any particular meaning, but that's an example of the sort of feeling that I'd want to plug into. It has to, if a religion made sense to me, if a belief system made sense to me, I'm looking for a place to park that feeling. I don't want something that seems to dismiss that. Although just because I feel it doesn't mean that it's important, but it feels somewhat important. This is a half quote. I know Carl Sagan said something about people being made of stardust. And I like to imagine the sort of abstract or dramatic depiction of the universe exploding into existence, and you've got Earth, and then the dust whips up and forms a person. It's like we grew out of the Earth. Obviously, I'm skipping evolutionary steps here, but this is my fanciful way of thinking of it. That being natural and part of everything, that also can feel at odds with my impression of religions. And I've been in a number of churches too. And the last thing I'll say before I let you say something what's the name of the part of a church where you go to snack and talk to people after a service?
You broke up a little bit.
Oh, what
is
the name of the part of a church where you go to after the service to mingle and snack?
Depends what denomination the church is.
Okay, yours.
Protestants will call it a fellowship hall.
Okay. The ones I have been in are quite strikingly different from the chapel. Right, because you got stained glass and a big, or at least the ones I like the best, stained glass and an organ, and it's more mysterious and old feeling, and there's ritual. And then I go and it's all modern, and people are making small talk and eating food that might seem kind of mean, and the whole thing feels so much less spectacular. I feel that there's a hint of something significant where the service happens, and then they lose it when they go around the corner.
Yeah.
So that's me talking for a while, but yeah. So
well, there's a lot there. The book you're referencing might be C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, which is a favorite book of mine.
It may be, because I've read that more than once.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. Oh, where to begin?
This was the part that I was worried about. I can tell you stuff about me, but I don't know exactly what I'm looking for from you. But I just want to see what happens.
Let me ask you this question.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what happened when Homo sapiens first came to North America is they wiped out almost all of the apex. They wiped out a good many of the large land animals, including the giant sloth. And in the modern period, we've pretty much cleaned up the rest. I mean, there's just a few places in the United States where you can actually find grizzly bears and wolves. Big cats are still out there, but they're very rare, and only very rarely do you hear of a mountain lion threatening a human being, and almost always make the news. Our impression of nature has changed quite dramatically over the last few hundred years. And even the definition of nature. I mean, we sort of now identify nature as that thing we find in the national park.
It's outdoors. Like indoors is normal, and outdoors is where you go to visit it.
Yes. But even the distinction, of natural. I mean, the distinction is really natural and human. And by drawing the line there, and this is something that I always sort of smile at, a thoroughgoing naturalist really shouldn't draw the line between natural and human, because if all we are is stuff generated by stars, then that's all we are. And no matter how much CO2 we convert petroleum into, it's a completely natural process, because human beings are just trousered apes.
That's a
We're
Lewis
we're
phrase.
not we're
That's a
not
Lewis
doing
phrase I always liked.
yeah, we're not doing anything different than this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding of why there's so much oxygen in our atmosphere is because at a certain point in Earth's development, a massive number of creatures started making it. And the process of the internal combustion engine converting petroleum to carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is categorically no less natural than all those little creatures that made oxygen how many billion years ago that we are now using. Because part of Lewis's point in his book Miracles is, if everything is just the whole show, then all there is nature.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the discussing we're doing is of no difference categorically than the translation of petroleum into carbon dioxide. That is all we are doing. That's Lewis's point in that book, that with that conceptualization of the world, that's all we're doing. One of the things we instinctively do, however, is we draw a line between indoors, now doors are made by human beings, and outdoors, which is supposedly nature. And the fact that we have colonized trees and turned them into doors, or colonized iron ore and coal and turned it into the steel door that is over here in my office, involves, it's at least in C.S. Lewis's book, something he calls reason, which is a very strange thing. Lewis basically in that book suggests that reason is a tell of the divine, because what we do, unlike, birds of paradise might make their little hut, dogs will scratch out their little den, but no other species in the world has transformed this world to the degree that we have. And either that is just simply natural, just us working out our programming, which is generated out of the randomness of being for reasons we can't explain, or there is something else going on with us. And figuring out what that something else is that gives you an experience of going out of doors is probably a worthwhile thing to explore, because it is likely a clue as to what you really are. Now, the Bible, of course, says that human beings are the stuff of earth and the breath of God, that we are these strange amphibious creatures that are, on one hand, subject to all of the decay that we see in the natural world around us, but we have pretenses to eternity. And you experience that I remember when I was a young man, I visited my grandmother, who at that point was in her 80s. I was in college, so I was in my teens, late teens, early 20s. And she might have been in her 70s at that point, 70s or 80s. And she said to me, she said, inside, I feel like I felt when I was your age. And then I look in the mirror and there's an old lady looking back at me. That's a very strange thing. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, here's a reason. Let me grab this book. This is the largest book by C.S. Lewis that no one ever reads. He spent a good bit of his career writing it. It is the Oxford volume of English literature in the 16th century. And I've never read it. I haven't read it yet. Is this book, what is the relationship between this book and the binding and the paper and the ink that makes it? Because in a weird way, what the book really is only manifest in this physical thing I'm holding in my hand. Just like in a strange way, that thing that I see as me is somehow related to this body, deeply related to this body, deeply related to this brain, all of this stuff. But in some ways, the me that you're talking to is partly a strange autobiography I've been writing since the age of 4.
Mhm.
But that's not all that's me, because my wife and my kids and you right now to a tiny little degree and others who have known me have a me that isn't exactly the same as that autobiography that I've been writing since the age of 4. Because as my grandmother observed, that autobiography that she was writing since the age of 4 and felt herself to be, that had all sorts of changes from puberty to womanhood to childbearing to middle age to old age and eventually to death. Something of that biography hasn't been completely lost. It's been a lot lost in this world. But right away, we can begin to get a sense of, well, what exactly is the stuff of heaven? The breath of God that has been breathed into the clay on the ground and has become a living nephesh. That's the Hebrew word. And it's sort of that thing that has made the door out of the wood and has made the CO2 out of the petroleum. And ironically, that is much more what we talk about when we talk about humanity than all the flesh we're carrying around. And how do we think about that?
Beats me. Um, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think I do understand what you're saying. I just don't have anything to immediately respond to it with. Um, but yeah, so I think I understand that point of view. Is there something you think I should do with it?
Well, how do you account for the fact that on one hand, you seem to be generated by this animal flesh, but on the other hand, another part of you seems completely disconnected to that? I mean, you sort of stop your autobiography at night, but then you're telling different stories, which you barely vaguely remember. And then you wake up and the autobiography begins. And when you bury your grandfather or grandmother and put them in the ground, we don't just all sort of shrug and move on with the rest of our day. We tell their story and we try to remember their story and we try to instantiate them in mementos in our room. I mean, we're a very strange creature
Definitely.
on this planet. And we don't really find, we see hints of ourselves in our dogs or in birds that we can teach some language to. But it's funny that the only way that the apes and the birds ever learn to talk to us is with a lot of contact with us. They don't do that with each other. And that all suggests that something deeply strange is going on in this world. And it might be worthwhile trying to figure it out. And in a lot of ways, you asked earlier, what is religion? Well, that's a lot of it.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. One is that perhaps another way of saying at least a bit of what you're saying is that there is on the one hand, it seems like an artificial distinction to consider humans to be unnatural, almost to be separate from nature. On the other hand, unless we're missing some evolutionary links, we seem notably different from everything else. So, and I have no answer to that. I'm not interested in justifying it on the spot. And I forgot what the second thing was that made me think of. But the religion deals with that. Yes. Now, another thing, I don't know if this is worth bringing up, but you might have something interesting to say to it, is that part of the impression and again, I want to emphasize, I'm presenting this as I'm in no way suggesting this is an accurate or complete impression. I'm just giving you the impression I've had over the years so that you can improve on it. One of the things, I actually already did reel off that list, is that it has seemed to me that, and I think this is a concern among people who are wary of religion generally, and often Christianity, is that people are either maybe not self-centered, maybe a little bit, or centered on some group. I say ethnocentric, I don't know if that's the right word or not. And they're using religion as justification for it. Like they're saying everything is about people, possibly about, and it makes sense in a way that might make sense to my culture and my time. And then that forms part of that feeling of a sort of a dead claustrophobic religion. Now, I'm definitely not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying I have encountered people where I do feel like, or at least I'm worried that that's what they're up to. But then at the same time, everybody does it. It's not like only people who consider themselves religious do that. So if someone just wants to dismiss religion as just protecting them from being afraid of dying, or wishful thinking and so on, that's part, to the extent that that's a valid criticism, that might be what it is. Not that I think it's a particularly good one. But at the same time, there's this funny thing, and this is something that watching Peterson emphasized too, is that this goes along with being stuck with, you can never be completely objective. So you have to live your life, I think, in some way as that, assuming that your human point of view is the one you should have. You can't really take any other one, and you have to find a way of making sense of your life. And it is necessarily going to be in human terms, which then means that I think, and this isn't a hard argument here, but it then means that to try and have a completely logical, perhaps scientific approach is doomed to fail. And it's not going to work, because that's not what people run on. I don't know what people run on, but I'm assuming it's something more like a fusion between, it's more like religion too, I think, because I think there was a conversation, I've watched the beginning of a few of your videos to try and get a sense of different things. I think it was one where you were talking to John Vervaeke, who I think is worth watching generally. What was I just saying? I've lost track of what I was thinking of. What was I talking about a second ago? Before I was bringing up this conversation.
Well, you're talking about rationality and science and what.
Right. Okay, this may be a mistake to wander off this way, but there was the question of whether people of the right balance of knowledge of what is versus what you should do about it, I think came up, something like that, or mythological truth versus pragmatic truth might have been the way it was framed. I forget what it was, and I don't want people who watch this who come from just wander into it won't know what I'm talking about necessarily, but and it seems to me you always need both, but as you get more primitive, as you go back in time, I would think what you'd have is they're just fused more directly. what something is and what you should do about it are the same thing. I think kids tend to view things more that way too. I think it's until you introduce this weird idea of objectivity in science, I think it's what people do. There's no distinction between what is and what you should do about it. Things mean something. A light isn't just an object. A light is something that makes light. And all this is just to say, I definitely agree to the extent that you're making this point, that something like religion in terms of making sense of the subjective experience of people is necessary, and it won't necessarily match perfectly with a more clunky scientific way of looking at things, I think.
Now you're using this word religion.
Mhm.
What do you mean by it?
I think I'm going to end up running into a circular definition, because off the top of my head, which is not where I sometimes like to think off the top of my head, but I would say it's an organized belief system, if that isn't too cheap a definition, that is focused on that asserts various things. It's a good question. Those things out there that have churches attached to them, that's a religion. I think
There's a website called the Cult of Apple. Is there a religion around Apple products?
there might be, although I don't know if it'd be all the elements. I haven't thought much about defining religion, so I can't say much of use on it. I mean, it is a problem when you talk about things. If you talk about them philosophically enough, it always comes down to definitions. It's very hard to just refer to something without then saying, well, what do you mean? And then it's useful because it clears up what we mean, but it actually also ends up meaning I have to think through an awful lot of stuff. What would you mean?
I think religion is our most basic map of how the world works. There's if you would ask people today, people in North America, name a religious book, probably the easiest answer you would get from people would be the Bible. It might shock people to learn that the word religion is only found twice in the Bible. And in neither context does it exactly refer to the things that we instinctively imagine religion to be. Tom Holland, who is an English writer of really interesting history books, there's a video of him on YouTube answering the question, were the Greeks religious? Now, we look back at the Greeks or the Romans or pretty much every civilization in world history and say, well, they're deeply religious. Well, why? Well, because they have temples and sacrifices and they're relating to the gods and all of that. And we define that as religion. Tom Holland makes the point that when we think of Hinduism, you don't really find that word until the British reach India, because the people on the subcontinent of India were going about their life, building temples, making sacrifices, burning wives when husbands died. They're, doing all the kinds of things that you can go to India and find today. It wasn't till the British came that, oh, well, we need a category to describe all of these kinds of things. That category is religion. Religion is actually a Christian category, which sort of blows our minds because we sort of associated it with temples and sacrifices and prayers and gods and all of these things. But when good old King Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter for fair winds so that he could sail his armies to Troy in support of his brother Menelaus, whose wife was sort of captured by Troy and taken there, or maybe wanted to get out of Menelaus, the bad marriage to Menelaus. Good King Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter, which his daughter's mother didn't really appreciate, and she would have her revenge later on, as Homer tells us. Agamemnon didn't think that he was doing anything religious. We look back and say, wow, what do you mean you don't know you're doing anything religious? Sacrificing your daughter to the god Poseidon seems like about the most abusive religious thing we can imagine ever happening. But that is our category by which we look back through time. What was he doing? He was making life work. He was trying to resolve a meteorological problem that was standing in the way of a political ambition or a brotherly commitment or how many other different layers. And so when we ask what religion is, we should probably look at how we're using the word, but we should probably look at people who aren't using the word, but we're labeling them with it. And so my definition is much more, well, your religion is whatever it is that you use or do to get what you want. That sets up the even more difficult question. If you thought answering this question of what is a religion is hard, if we really start to get at the question, what do you want? That seems easy. I maybe want a cold drink of water, or I maybe want a better job, or I maybe want a more satisfying relationship with a spouse or with a child, or I maybe want, all these things that we want. But if we keep pushing that question, it sort of unfolds into something that seems to have a horizon that suggests that there's more, because this business of wanting seems to go on and on and on and on, because when you get what you want, you discover you want something more. And so religion is deeply connected with that. Agamemnon wants to get to Troy, so he sacrifices his daughter. He wasn't being religious. We say he was. That should give us an indication that, is there anything that isn't religious? So
that's actually, I'm glad you presented all this. Initially, I wasn't sure where we were headed, but actually this is interesting to me. Because I was going to say, it sounds like from this point of view, which I'll have to think about more, and it's very much consistent with things I'd thought. It's just taking them in a step further. Does it make sense? Is it useful to think of everyone as having a religion, essentially? And the question is, well, what to use your example, what is it that you want or want most? What is your, in some more abstract philosophical way, sort of what's your map of how to get there? How do you operate? And then the question, for example, if I was to say, I was trying to figure out various ways of presenting what I'm interested in talking to you about. And another way that I could have presented it was, let's say I walked into your church and said, okay, sign me up. I don't know what happens here, but I want in on it. And then because I'm me and not someone else, then you'd say things and I'd ask questions and I'd clarify it, and it's not at all confrontational. It's me trying to figure out, how do I wear this religion? But so what that would mean in the context of what you're just saying about everyone being religious is it's more of a perhaps a conversion and also just a clarifying of what I think and want and how I operate and so that seems like a useful way to look at it. Is there anything else? I know I've been keeping track of the time, and I believe you've got about 12 minutes before you want to.
No, I've got 11:18 here, so I can go to 11:45. So we got about a half hour.
Oh, great. Anyway, good. Because one thing I don't want to do is say, okay, here's a profound, difficult question. You got 5 minutes, go.
That's usually what happens with pastors, because someone comes into your office for an hour appointment. They don't talk about what they want to talk about until the last 5 minutes.
Um,
Normal.
okay, so in the context of your definition of religion, or if what you can take this either way. Well, maybe we should make it about me, because this is supposed to be a show where I improve me. So you can talk about yourself if you want, but the basic question is, what things might I look at to figure out what my current religion is, by your definition, and then how might I compare it to, what adjustments might I make to make it more like whatever your religion is. Granted that there's going to be a lot of similarity anyways, right? It doesn't matter what we say and believe and do. We're pretty similar, I bet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
We're very similar. And this tag that I have of Christian and your tag of not Christian, or whatever tag you want to place yourself on, those tags are of minimal value because we live in a context that has been deeply molded by Christianity in ways that we don't see. It's
right.
like when my older sister was quite young, maybe 6, she declared to my parents that she was running away from home, probably due to some unjust treatment she felt she was receiving. And my mother said, "That's fine, but we bought all the clothes, so you have to leave them here." It wasn't a big trip. And that little illustration just goes to show we often can't see what we assume. And I mentioned Tom Holland. Here's a book you might want to read, Dominion, because the point that he makes in the book is, in the West, for the most part, we are just continuing to work through implicit questions in Christian theology again and again and again. And most of our fights are just that. So, if you want to figure out what your religion is, I would suggest trying to figure out what you really trust in. Most people trust in themselves, money, certain other people.
What do you mean trust in money?
Well, if I were to take away all of your money and heavily mortgage your house, would you have trouble sleeping at night?
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
You never know.
We trust in all sorts of things around us, but we don't realize we're trusting in them, because if they're in place, they're fine. But if you want to know what your religion is, so I have a very short definition of Christianity.
Good.
And the definition is this: do you trust in Jesus more than you trust yourself? If you start thinking about that, well, do I trust myself? Well, then what I'm really doing is some ways playing on some of Jesus' words, because love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's then begins to ask people, well, do I love myself? And then just in the last few decades, people are like, I need to love myself. Well, there you go. And it's weird in the ways that we don't actually love ourselves very well. Jordan Peterson in 12 Rules for Life makes the point, and he's quite right, that people, Jordan Peterson, one of his rules is take care of yourself in the way that you take care of someone someone else you're entrusted to. And the truth that parents often take care of their children better than they take care of themselves. Not always. But this business of trust, I think, is really what we're trying to get at because what do we trust in? And often the only way to know that is to ask ourselves, what makes us anxious? Because obviously the relationship between our trusts and our anxieties are together. Jesus says something in the Sermon on the Mount that most people sort of glaze over because there's all these commands in the Bible. Well, here's one, do not worry. And when I tell people that, certain kinds of people look at me like I've just told them to turn water to wine. Because what do you mean, do not worry? Well, why do you worry? That's actually a really complicated question. You find that some people worry more than others. You find that some people worry partly because of their biology or because of their upbringing or on and on and on. And so a Christian trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves.
Now, I don't know if this is a fruitful direction to go in or not, but to me, the obvious part of that statement to expand is the Jesus part, because while it might be, I think you've done at least a half decent job of giving some idea how one would define trust. Figuring out what the Jesus is that you trust is massive. So I don't know if there's anywhere we can go in that with that right now. But I just thought,
well, is Jesus a dead, failed Roman Jewish revolutionary? Or when you sit down and cry out to Jesus, does it make a difference in the world, in the physical world? And if so, how? I mean, that's why it's such a lot of Christians hear that little definition and they sort of get it because they have been socialized and they are wrapped in an entire worldview. I would say, well, maybe an American is someone who trusts the American government more than they trust themselves. And you will discover a lot of people trust their government more than they trust themselves. Well, in what way? Well, I believe that my government will, provide Social Security. Maybe if you live in Canada, my government will provide health care. My government will, not let COVID ravage too hard. But then you might add, well, wait a minute. Tell me about this government. Where is this government located? And you might point to a building. And I would say, well, let's say we would dynamite that building or even just tear it down because it's too old. Would the government go away? No, government doesn't go away then. Well, what about the leader? Well, maybe the president or the prime minister. If the prime minister gets assassinated, does the government go away? No, the government doesn't go away. Well, what on earth are we talking about then? Oh, and the more you begin to push at things that we simply use colloquially all over our life, the more you begin to realize, wow, what a strange world this is. Wow, how amazingly all of this stuff sort of works. What on earth is a government? What on earth is Jesus? What on earth is a human being? It's really strange stuff. Well, you and I are two human beings, but how deep does this really go?
Yeah, well, this is the sort of thing I find fun. And I mean, that's a perfect example of how you can take something that seems fairly narrow defined and possibly dull, and then expand it into something that's much more intriguing and mysterious, and leaves you with further to look into it.
And here's to go swing all the way back to where we started this conversation. Would you have a reasonable expectation that if you walked into a church building and found a guy who was employed by that place to manage all of this crazy religious thing, could you have an interesting conversation that you might actually find productive and fruitful? Because as you said earlier, not everybody sits and listens to these questions very much or really wants to think about them, but you do. Why? Because you have a sense that these questions not only are just, these aren't just little abstractions, that if you actually found some answers to these questions, these might radically shape how you spend your money, you know, who you share your sexual organs with, how you vote, what you eat, who you spend time with, and whatever influence you might have over the future course of the world. That's why you like these questions, because you see that they're connected to a lot, and you actually want to orient yourself in the world according to the answers of these questions. And I would say all of that is deeply religious.
I would say, not to disagree in a substantial way, but that I'm interested in these things because I get such a kick out of thinking about them. It is its own reward. It's not clear whether there's a practical orientation or not. It feels it feels worthwhile for its own sake to think about this stuff. I do feel like I'm getting more connected with something real and important. I feel like I'm maybe even becoming more real or more substantial. But I even wonder if part of the reason that it's so interesting to me is because it is separate somewhat from day-to-day life. Because I feel more free to play around with the stuff. I'm not sure. I don't know. As I said, it doesn't matter to me too much what's the case. But your point is that it is religious to be interested in those things, which is an interesting case because, as per my opening, I want to say definition, but as per my past experience or impression, I would have said that those interests were precisely the kinds of things that are not looked at by people who would describe themselves as religious, that I have encountered. But a big part, and again, I feel like I need to emphasize that I'm not. This is nothing about what I've presented is meant to be a criticism of anybody. If it is of anyone, it's of my own impressions. But I thought,
we all have a limited sample that we're dealing with in the world, and your observation doesn't offend me, because in most churches, most people are sort of doing like Agamemnon. They're trying to get through life. And the fact that they're praying and singing and doing that in a room that might have deep wood and burgundy and stained glass, and then they're going and eating sort of Costco cookies, Costco at best, they're probably Keebler, whatever they got at the dollar store, over in the room next to it that looks like kind of a crappy breakfast room in a Ramada Inn. There's stuff tied to all of that. And the fact that you would look at this and say, well, this is totally unimpressive. Well, yeah, but that's the way all of us look from the outside. Unless we're really using all sorts of cultural tags to try and impress one another, which are what? A Maserati instead of a Toyota, or clothing covered with glitters, or hours in a gym to have huge muscles, or plastic surgery, or I mean, these are all the games that we play, and
right. But I don't. But the chapel's the. Wait a minute, is my term right? Is the chapel where the services occur?
It's chapel, sanctuary,
right.
Various different words.
That's my favorite part.
Why would they put all that money into? I mean, there's sort of a balance of money when you build a church. Let's say you have $5 million you're going to spend. How much are you going to spend on the place that you eat bad cookies after church, and how much are you going to spend on, now we're going to get into value, which is a whole nother conversation. How much are you going to spend on this room where everyone sits quietly and maybe the preacher talks and maybe there's music and maybe there's silence? Well, that's being the difference in the decor speaks to the value. And you might say, well, that seems rather undemocratic to put all that value in a room where you're not even talking to each other and eating. You're sort of quietly sitting there with your thoughts, or engaging in an internal monologue with divinity or the universe or a god, you know. But the tell, you exactly picked up on the tell, even if they're not conscious of, well, of course we're going to spend a lot of money on those deep woods in the sanctuary, and we've just blown all our money on that room, and so it's white paint, sheetrock, and crappy cookies in the other room.
I'm not going to tell churches how they should run, but I think it would be nice if, like, especially, the whole thing, you go there once, maybe a couple times a week. It's nice if the whole experience feels religious. Like, I like the idea. I haven't thought about it a lot, that your environment actually tells you something about how important your activities are, or how important you are, or how sincerely to take what you're doing.
How much money do people spend on weddings? Why?
Too much. See, I go the other way there. I feel like,
Yeah, exactly.
Well, anyway, I still think that something could be. Is it? Do you think it's purely a matter of money, or, like, I wasn't sure if it was a more modern
No. And
edition.
your point is real. But this gets into a lot of other deeper things, in that the organ and the stained glass and the dark woods and the burgundy in that one room facilitate something. And actually, if the church, when you're actually building a church, one of the, this stuff just gets so deep. So if you look at a big box evangelical church in a suburban area, you will probably find that their sanctuary is maybe called an auditorium and has painted sheetrock, and all of the money is in the stage lights, the sound equipment, the musical instruments, and now the video cameras. Why? Because that church is delivering, using, as John Vervaeke would call, a psychotechnology to afford a level of self-transcendence to the people sitting in the seats. And one would be not clueless to notice the similarities between that and a movie theater, as opposed to, let's say, a cathedral, where, here's the funny thing about old churches. Most old churches don't have that crappy room where you eat cheap cookies. They just have they just have the main room. And it was only later on that churches started adding the sheetrock room with the bad cookies.
That was
and yeah,
I mean, obviously, that's what they look like. They don't look like if they looked like an old simple room, that would be neat too. Like, if they had old blocks of stone and they were cold, that would be its own experience.
But often what was happening, but now let's pay more attention, because, well, so those buildings that just have the sanctuary, how could they get away with not having a fellowship hall? Well, because that church, when was that church built? That church was probably built before the 20th century. How did people get to church? They walked. Where did they live in relationship with the church? Just down the road. Who were they worshiping with? Everyone else who just lived down the road. What did they do after church? Went back into each other's homes and did that fellowship thing in the homes. In other words, that fellowship room on the side of the church is actually an extension of the home, not the church, because the church building is functioning within a larger ecosystem. You only start seeing fellowship halls happen once people have to drive to church, or take public transportation to church. Because what do you do after church? Well, you talk to the other people who are the church. Where are you going to talk to them? You're not going back to the house, which is just across the street. You want a place to stop and stay. I guess we got to build a room for that because we don't want to stand in the rain. And that's where the fellowship hall developed. And that's why it looks like it does, as opposed to the church. And what about the crappy cookies? Well, it used to be we would come home and everyone would go to the patriarch or the matriarch's home, and there would be all of the food and everything in the pantry, and be like going to Bilbo Baggins' Hobbit hole, and there would be hospitality. But now we need cookies for a few hundred people. Well, how are we going to get cookies for a few hundred people? We're living in an industrialized place, and so we go to the bakery industry and we buy them. You see, all of this stuff has all of these layers, but when we walk in the 20th century, we don't think about the fact that, why is it that any church built before 1900 doesn't have a parking lot? Well, because there weren't any cars. Well, how did they get here? Well, they walked. Well, how did that change the relationship between the church building and the neighborhood and the community compared to in the 1950s? There was a church growth guy that was writing books saying, if you want your church to grow, you need to build a parking lot. And so what churches did was buy the buildings next door, tear them down so they could have a parking lot so people would drive to church. But then they built the additional buildings onto the church because you weren't going back home right afterwards. You were staying right there with the people. But all of this stuff is built into all of the rest of the world around us. But we don't see it because we've only been alive for a few decades.
Mhm.
So there's lots going on. But we can't manage all of that lots because we don't have enough time in our lives. So, gosh, we just finished singing together and having the Lord's Supper and calling each other brother and sister. I just want to have a conversation with you, but I don't want to stand in the snow. Well, let's build this room over here. All right. Well, how much money do we have left for that? Well, it took centuries to put this other building up. We need to build this one like next year. Bang. There it looks. But now you're going to have a tradition. It just goes on and on.
Wonder if you could have a business that redecorated those rooms.
Oh, trust me. Churches work on this stuff all the time. So when the seeker movement came through, which took out all of the wood and the paneling and the stained glass and had made the sanctuary look like a junior college auditorium, because in the 1980s, people who were raised in the 50s got all nervous around stained glass. So they made the auditorium look like an auditorium. And then they said, and you know what? The stuff that you eat at church is horrible. The coffee comes out of this big urn. The snacks are horrible. And so guess what? If you look at a church built in about 1990, you're going to find a fairly plain auditorium in certain traditions. And then you're going to find, we've got comfy chairs. We've got a fireplace. We've got Starbucks coffee. We've got stuff from the best bakery in town. And the place where you're doing worship looks like an auditorium, but you're putting all your money into electric guitars and drums and musicians to get that transcendent experience in your brain. And then afterwards, you're going into this place that looks like a living room. Did you ever think of what funeral halls are? Funeral halls also, funeral parlors, they have an auditorium, and then it looks like a living room. It kind of looks like grandma's living room. Well, that's because 80 years ago, that all was happening in the home too, but the house didn't have a parking lot. People got a little creeped out when grandpa was lying in the front hallway overnight. I know plenty of people that can tell me that story. So all of this stuff just continues to go. But no, you're right, because people come along and say, "Wow, I kind of hate this room. Why can't we have a fireplace and some chairs and sofas?" And So now I also know a church in Tucson, Arizona, whose sanctuary is sofas and easy chairs, and their sanctuary looks like a living room. All of this stuff has meaning, and we're mostly doing it without a lot of theological reflection, but it's happening in churches all the time.
Hmm. That's interesting that they experiment so much with that. It feels to me like it's an important part of it, and I'd be wary of making anything too stark or too modern, because
Well,
part of
the funny thing was, so in the 1980s, those who were built in the 60s that got all claustrophobic about stained glass and churchiness, then suddenly had music that sounded like jazz band and light rock and pop music in church. And then their kids came along and said, this isn't like church. I want a cathedral and I want liturgy. And it's just, you're just going through this generational churning. And
right.
so churches and pastors actually study and watch this stuff all the time. And so then we look at you and say, oh, you know what kind of church this guy would be, just by, I don't know what your age is, but just looking at you, I sort of guess it. You're the kind of guy who wants the wood and the liturgy. You want it to feel religious, because otherwise, what's the point of going to church?
Mhm.
And so church plants that we started in the 1990s had guitars and rock bands and skits and, places that looked like auditoriums. Churches we started in the 2000s and 2010s, weekly liturgy, remember your baptism, weekly communion, still have to have good music, still have to have good coffee, but you want the feels, you want the religious feels, because, hey, if I want a show, I'll go to the theater. That's what's going on.
Hmm. Well, I'm just looking to see if there's anything else I can. Actually, you're pretty much out of time, aren't you?
Yeah, mostly.
Well, that's fine because I'm out of ideas. Anyways, this was interesting. I wasn't sure how it would go. I knew what I wanted, how I wanted to start, but after that, it was just a matter of where it goes. But I've got a couple interesting things to think about. If you're interested, I would be interested in doing this again sometime. But I don't want to put you on the spot right now.
You should, do you know what a Discord server is?
Somewhat.
Okay.
I actually have signed up for Discord because it's becoming important for following various people.
So I would recommend, you see, part of the problem. So one of the things that I talk about in my work is what I call estuary, which is in some ways exactly what you're trying to get at, because you're saying, hey, I want to talk about the important things in life. And I have very low expectations that these churches or religions will have anything meaningful to say to me. Because for the most part, religious people are sort of talking to each other.
Mhm.
And it's, you're kind of out here and they're like, oh, no, I'm not going to pay any attention to you. All the action's going on in here. And so estuary has been an attempt to open up the church doors a little bit and say, let's have some places that we can talk. And so the Bridges of Meaning Discord server is a place that we can do this, because whereas I love having these conversations because of the miracle of YouTube, I now have more demand on my time to have these conversations than I have time to do, and not forsake the people in this church building that has its own history and doesn't have any hardwood, because it never had the money for it.
Is that why you were on about it?
No, it's just church life. So sure, we can talk again if we can find the time, but there are lots of people who love doing what we're doing. And if you can find them, you don't have to wait for me. And so that's part of the reason why I work with the people who started. The Bridges of Meaning Discord server grew out of the local meetup where I was practicing some of these things here in Sacramento because of my videos. So I'm not saying we can't talk again. I'm just saying it's not always easy to get a slot.
Yeah,
So
no, I know. I have this idea, and I'm not pushing this on you in particular, but that it would be interesting for my podcast to have new people, but also have regulars. I just thought it'd be fun to have like a monthly minister comes in and converts me or tries to convert me as a regular thing. So, but yeah, I don't expect you to do that, but I am looking for people who could perhaps have that function or something of the sort. So
and I would also recommend that if you look at, I would dare bet that where you live, depending on where within driving distance, because churches now have parking lots, you could probably find people who are interested in these kinds of conversations. It's not necessarily easy, and these conversations are, they don't just necessarily fall off a truck or you get them in a box from Amazon. But I guess part of my work and the community around me has been designed to do was give people a better shot at finding satisfying conversation partners about these things which are most important. So
yeah, I have looked. I have talked to a couple people, and yeah, if I say more, I'll just keep talking, and you need to go, so I'll stop talking.
well,
Um,
I will. Well, I have the same problem, and I'm the one who needs to go. But I will say this: if you want me to share this video, the people who follow my channel will watch this video, and they'll probably want to talk to you, or they might want to talk to you because now there's more and more of them to talk with each other. So there's sort of a curve going on here. But yeah, so because my channel is full of people who like doing what I do, which is why they watch me do it.
mhm.
And you're exactly right. Some of the people on my channel are regulars. Some of the people on my channel are ones or twosies. But on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, this is a place where we sort of gather and find each other and try to have these conversations. So a little advertisement.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know it's standard for people to give to allow their guests to put in a pitch for their channel and so on. So you're welcome to do that. I'll put links to your stuff in the description.
Super.
So yeah.
Thank you, Julian.
Oh, thank you very much.
It was fun talking to you.
Yes, perhaps again.
And we'll be in touch. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.